please take some more cards and just give them out to friends of yours or who might want to look at the website. Because on the website I also, in addition to putting my own books on, I also have a section for recommended ministries, and about 30 different ministries on there that I'm recommending as good, and more to follow as I find and check them out. And so I'm recommending people who I think are reliable and trustworthy. So there's some good stuff on there that you can follow on and take a link to onto their websites. So we're on the subject of faithfulness. We're continuing that. And I'm going to just try and be a little quicker now. So God is continually looking around, basically, and always has been, in every generation for people that will be completely his, who are going to be completely committed to him, genuinely devoted to him. We're told in 2 Chronicles 16:9, "For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his." So he's looking for those people in every generation. And we're told in Ezekiel that he says, "I searched for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand in the gap before me for the land, so that I would not destroy it, but I found no one." What a sorry situation that was. If he could have just found one person, but he couldn't find anybody. So we need to remain true and faithful to God and represent him accurately and faithfully, no matter how isolated that may cause us to be. And there's a very disturbing further passage from Ezekiel where it speaks of something rather worrying, where God sends out angels as executioners. He sends out executioners to the people, but he specifies that they put a mark on the forehead of all those who are faithful, who have not engaged in abominations, and who were appalled and grieved about those abominations. And it's in Ezekiel 9, and it says, "Draw near, you executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand." And I'll miss out a bit, and it says, "And the Lord said to him, Go through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark upon the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it." And then the executioners are told to slay everybody. It says, "But touch no one upon whom is the mark." So, a little bit reminiscent of the mark that's going to come later, isn't it? But this is a mark that God is putting on the foreheads of the faithful. And what are they doing? They're not necessarily changing society and causing there to be no abominations. What are they doing? They're simply grieved over what's going on. So these are people who are seriously in the minority, and they're grieved and appalled by what causes God to be grieved and appalled. Now, I would like to have such a mark put upon my forehead today and want to be classed as having such a mark. And I think we should all want that. And there's no reason why that should be given just to those people. I think God treats us exactly the same. He's noticing us and seeing the people who have that faithfulness. He's identifying the people who he can rely on, who are trustworthy, who are devoted to him, and he can count on them today. And sometimes God can't find even one faithful person in a situation or in a workplace. But you could be that person in your workplace or in your street or in your club or society or group or family. The one who is trustworthy and faithful that God can use to rebuild the wall and stand in the gap. And sometimes he'll turn his entire anger and judgment away from a group, or at least delay his judgment, because there is one faithful person in that place. And it could be that you could be that person, just the one and only, who's faithful, and by doing so, provide more time for the others to repent and come through to faith. Because you were there, they were spared. They were given more time because of you. So, growing as a disciple, one of the principal things in growing as a disciple and in faithfulness is moving from one test to the next. I don't know if you've noticed this, but life is just a series of tests. And God operates in a similar manner to how a manager operates. A good manager has objectives for each of us that work for him, for growth and development, mainly in character, but also in knowledge, skill, and experience. So that manager wants to put you through your tests to get you to gain more knowledge, but he also has another objective. He wants to know how far you've come. So sometimes a manager just wants to see what you're made of. Well, God is exactly the same. He wants to know where you're at, where you've got to. And so he's searching the heart. It says here in 1 Chronicles, the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. And it says again in 1 Chronicles 29, I know, my God, that you test the heart. So he's testing people not only to put them through their paces and let them grow from the experience, but to find out. God actually wants to find out about you. It's like a scientific test. He wants to know what you're made of. And we see this happen in the life of King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah has to face a big trial, bigger than any of us are going to have to face, when the representatives of the king of Babylon come to Judah and threaten him. And God wanted to test Hezekiah. We're told directly. It says, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. So God puts Hezekiah through this enormous ordeal, and one of his objectives was to test Hezekiah. Can you imagine that? Well, God is doing the very same with us, and we need to become alert to the fact that life is this series of tests. That what God's want, and ask ourselves, when we face a test, firstly, what does God want me to learn? And secondly, what is God trying to find out about me? What am I being tested on? And there'll be no promotion for any of us unless we're faithful at our current level. That's true in our working life. It's true in the Christian life. No manager is going to put you in charge of a chain of shops if you can't be faithful running one shop. No one's going to put you in charge of one shop if you can't be faithful as a shop assistant or as a deputy manager or as a whatever. You're never going to go higher until you achieve faithfulness at your current level. But many of us don't realize that that principle has anything to do with the Christian life. We think it has something to do with running shops. We can grasp that, we can accept that, but we don't think it's got anything to do with the Christian life. But it does. And the more we can recognize these tests, the better we're likely to be able to pass them. Because if we don't pass God's tests, He's just going to have to keep resitting it. So He's going to put you in again and again for your 11 plus. And you could be 65 and you're taking your 11 plus for the 55th time. But He won't let you get past it until you pass your 11 plus, and then all he'll do to reward you for passing your 11 plus is to give you some more tests at a higher level. So as soon as you pass a test, you move on to the next test. Because promotion comes from faithfulness in God's kingdom. There's no promotion until you're faithful at your current level. And we see this illustrated in the life of King David. He was promoted by many stages, but it began when he was 17. And it didn't begin with fighting Goliath. It began with caring for sheep. That was a test. It says, from tending the ewes that had young, He brought him to be the shepherd of Jacob his people, of Israel his inheritance. With upright heart he tended them and guided them with skillful hand. He's talking about David's handling of sheep. That was a test. Now, who would have thought that looking after sheep has anything whatever to do with anything? But God thinks it's got everything to do with everything. He thinks it's hugely significant how you look after sheep. And so there's this boy looking after sheep faithfully. I can sort of imagine this. I can imagine David being one of these lads who's tremendously diligent, reliable, bold, courageous, full of initiative, took his job seriously. I've seen people like that I've managed and been impressed by. And God was just impressed by him, by his attitude, not his ability, attitude. So, given that we have these tests to take, the thing for us to do is to knuckle down and pass them and recognize that they exist, recognize what they are, recognize there is such a thing. So therefore, any current difficulty or crisis that we might be facing suddenly takes on a wholly different meaning and purpose and significance. Suddenly it has a purpose. It's not just pointless and futile and meaningless and random. There are no random events in God's economy. Things are happening Whatever the reason, we don't even need to be bothered what the reason is. The point is, what's the purpose of it? The test is there to enable us to be promoted. So God sets these tests, but he nearly always disguises them. So they come through other people, through clients, customers, colleagues, neighbors, friends, bosses, and so on. And he uses them to test us. And we need to recognize that and say to ourselves, well, how can I now look at life differently and see life as a series of tests? If we were doing that, we're much more likely to do well than if we don't even know that we're being tested or have any policy towards the tests. So, let's look at someone who was unfaithful. King Saul. He was unfaithful and disobedient. And in the end, he was replaced by God. Because God's no respecter of persons. Nobody's above being disciplined by God. And this is a man who was chosen because of his qualities and because he was the best man available. But even though he was the best man available when he was given the job, that did not mean that God wouldn't remove him for unfaithfulness. And nobody is beyond being removed or replaced because of their unfaithfulness. Because we're told in Romans, God does not show favoritism. In Acts, he's no respecter of persons. And then in Colossians, but he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. And then in 1 Peter, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially. So he's going to judge each of us, and he's not going to say, well, go easy on us because we're Christians, or not judge us because we're Christians. We'll be judged just the same as everyone else. And he won't go easy on us because we were in a church, or refrain from removing us from something, or refrain from demoting us. He will do that, just as he did with Saul. So, obviously we need to be faithful to God personally. That's the most important thing. We've also got to be faithful to God's word. And it's not overstating the position to say that we demonstrate our faithfulness to him most clearly by the attitude we adopt towards his word, his written word. And you cannot say that you love God or respect him or honor him any more than you love, respect, or honor his written word, because it's in a certain sense a kind of proxy for him. And so we might try and kid ourselves and say, well, no, I really, really love and honor and respect God, but I don't really feel called to really study his word. I just want to really relate to him. And I've heard people talk that way, but it's a severe form of self-delusion, because he has made the Bible into the principal means by which we know him. He has ordained that, and it's not open to us to say, well, I want to respect, honor, and obey him in different ways, other than the way that he has said he wants to be respected, honored, and obeyed. So the Bible is the beginning and the most important way that we can do that and show our faithfulness. Let's look at someone who is a model of faithfulness, and that's Daniel. He's a role model for us. Now, he faced more pressures and problems than most of us are ever going to face. And he had temptations and opportunities for pride, corruption, compromise, but he never became proud, he never became corrupt, he never compromised. Not even his enemies could find any fault in him, in what he was doing. And we're told in Daniel 6, the presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. Wouldn't that be marvelous to have that said about you at the judgment seat? Or to have it said now? So we know Daniel best because of the lion's den, when he risked his life. In fact, he didn't risk his life, he gave up his life. He went in there, as far as any right-thinking person would be concerned. In the absence of a miracle, he was going to die by going in there. Now, the point is, we'd be wrong to think that was the first test Daniel ever faced. God doesn't ordinarily put us into big tests like that as the first thing he does. So the tests for Daniel were many, many, many tests long before that. God starts off with small tests and builds us up to larger ones, stage by stage. Likewise with Daniel's 3 friends, cast into the fiery furnace. That wasn't the first test. The first test we know about was the test about kosher food. So that wasn't quite as life-threatening or dangerous as the other things they did. But the point was, there were these teenagers, and they had the courage and the faithfulness to make a stand over what they ate. That was what you might call a little test, although I think many of us would call that a big test. But relative to what they later faced, it was a small test. And because they passed that test, they qualified for other tests. But I don't think Daniel would ever have found his way into the lion's den if he hadn't passed the little tests along the way at the beginning. So if we're not willing to make a stand on small issues and little tests, if we're not willing to face criticism or disapproval or ridicule or being held back in our careers or missing a promotion, then we'll never develop the level of faithfulness that's needed to face the huge tests like martyrdom or the loss of livelihood or home that some people are now being called upon to face in this country as we move increasingly into an era of political correctness. One of the jobs I did in the later years of my law firm was representing people who were getting in the wrong end of the law for political correctness. And that's coming in a bigger way. And such people were put under pressure about their jobs, incomes, homes, and so forth. And that's where it's coming increasingly. But we won't be able to pass those sort of tests if we're not willing to be laughed at or criticized or considered unsophisticated or considered unintellectual. You're not one of these unsophisticated people who believes in creation, are you? Because that would make people want to laugh at you if you believe the Bible. Well, are you willing to be laughed at by people who think that that's something to laugh at? I mean, in a sense, that it's they who are being absurd, but they don't see it that way. They think that's something to laugh at. But if you're not willing to be laughed at for God's sake, how can you be losing your home for his sake? Or losing your job, or losing your life? And so we build up the muscles by doing these smaller tests. And God honors those who honor him. So it's not only that we learn the habit of faithfulness, that is true, we do that. We build the muscle of faithfulness and courage, but also, if you honor God in small ways, he will give you grace and courage when the time comes for bigger tests. He will be faithful to you when the big tests come because you were faithful to him in the small tests. And so we need to take these tests seriously and also rely on God in them when we face them. So I'm reminded of the sort of overconfident bravado of Peter when he was facing a test. And he entered into that test in the wrong way. The test of whether he would, betray Jesus. Of course he wouldn't. He was going to stay with him to the end and so forth. And what Peter should have done was to pray for the ability to remain faithful. But he didn't. He was presumptuous and announced that he would stay faithful. And therefore he hadn't got God's grace to help him to pass that test when it came. But if he'd asked for the grace, God would have found a way to enable him to pass that test. But he didn't seek the grace because he was presumptuous, as we all are. So back to King Saul. He wasn't faithful, and therefore he was removed. But he began well, and he showed great promise at the beginning. Now, he wasn't removed because he made mistakes or failed or lost battles or wasn't successful economically. None of that. He lost God's approval because he was unfaithful. And God wasn't satisfied with his level of personal faithfulness. It had nothing to do with lacking success or achievement. In fact, God doesn't even talk about that. He doesn't even honor the subject with even mentioning it. He mentions nothing at all about the level of personal success that Saul had. On the face of it, he actually was reasonably successful. He built up the kingdom and made it reasonably large. But God isn't bothered about that. He was bothered about his faithfulness or lack thereof. And Saul acted impetuously, and he also exceeded his proper authority. And on a fateful occasion, when Samuel was late, he went ahead and offered the sacrifices without waiting for Samuel. And he was disobedient to what God said. And he feared the opinions of the people rather than fearing God and wanting to please him. Because You can please people or you can please God, but you can't please both. You have to make a choice between one or the other. And it's best to make an early choice that you're not going to set out to please people, but rather you're going to please God. And hopefully people will be pleased, but probably not. But whether they're pleased or not, you're just going to do what God says no matter what, whether people are pleased or not. So King Saul didn't need any more skill or cleverness or tallness or anything like that. He had all those things. He was a model citizen. He was the best man available for the job and probably made less mistakes or fewer mistakes than David did. In many ways, he committed fewer sins than David. But the difference was he didn't know how to repent. He didn't know how to restore intimacy with God. He wasn't faithful. David was more of a man for making mistakes and blunders in some ways, but he knew how to repent. And so God told Saul one day through Samuel, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart." Wouldn't that be terrible to hear that said to you? If Jesus said something similar at the judgment seat, that he considered you unfaithful and was going to appoint someone else to the position that he had in mind for you, and you were going to be Under Secretary of State for Drains and Sewers in the kingdom. But now, because of your unfaithfulness, someone else is going to be that, and you're going to be running, sweeping floors or something. Wouldn't that be awful to hear that said to you? When you could have been what he had in mind for you. So, what God was looking for in David and in all of us, he says, when Samuel is looking at all the sons of Jesse, they're all big strapping film stars, all of them. And it says, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him." This is talking about the others. "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." Now, what was wrong with them? They were all good soldiers. They rose to high ranks in the army. They were good men, in many ways talented. But they hadn't got David's faithfulness. That's what God was looking for. And David demonstrated that in the way he took on Goliath. One of the things that comes out clearly is the fact that David was outraged by Goliath. It wasn't just that David was a hero. He was outraged. How dare he speak like this? Because he was insulting God, insulting Israel. And he had such a heart of loyalty that he wanted to vindicate God's name. He couldn't bear to hear it being done or said. So he showed faithfulness and courage the day when he took on Goliath. And our faithfulness, if we're faithful, will lead us into situations of danger, risk, damage to reputation, finance, status, or even our lives. And we need to show similar courage and faithfulness to what David showed that day. Moving on, as David grew in age, as he went into his 20s, David refused to seize the throne from Saul. So he knew he'd already been anointed king. Samuel had told him, "You're going to be king." He knew he would be king. And he'd been anointed king. So he knew all this. So what would you do if you'd been anointed by Samuel and you knew you were going to be king? Wouldn't you want to try and speed it up a bit and make it happen? But he refused to seize the throne by force or manipulation. And he was sorely tested on one occasion when Saul came into the cave and David was in there with his men. And they thought, here it is, a prime opportunity. It's quite obvious that God has brought him here for you to kill him. This is what we've been waiting for. But they all thought, this is clearly an answer to prayer. There's clearly an opportunity. But it wasn't an opportunity, it was a test, you see. And we need to distinguish between opportunities and tests. In fact, it was a kind of trick. Because David refused to do it. He said, "I'm not going to kill Saul, not here." He already knew he was going to be king. He already knew he'd been anointed king. It was going to happen. But he wasn't going to make it happen. And he wasn't going to speed it up. And he wasn't going to do anything wrong to make it happen. And if he had killed Saul that day, it would have been wrong, and he would have entered into the kingship in a wrong way. And one of the reasons why he was so successful as king is he entered into it in the right way. So he knew that wasn't an opportunity, that it was a test. And we need to equally learn to distinguish those times when something looks like an opportunity but isn't. It's actually a chance to do something carnal, a chance to do something proud, a chance to do something hasty, a chance to do something arrogant, a chance to do something impulsive. Apparently to do good, but actually in the wrong way, with the wrong spirit, with the wrong mood or tone or attitude. And that isn't then what God wants us to do. And we need to identify those times and refrain from grabbing what God is offering to us. So David was recorded as being effectively the best king Israel ever had. But God also sets out his assessment of the other kings in very candid detail. I'm going to very briefly run through a few of them, but I go into much more detail in the book. And God assesses each of these men, and you'd imagine that God would talk about them on their abilities and their successes and their achievements and their victories and what happened to the gross domestic product and what happened to inflation and the balance of payments and unemployment level. He doesn't mention any of that. Not a jot of that it ever gets a mention. But if we were measuring some government today, those are pretty much the only things we talk about. He doesn't mention any of that, and he goes right through the kings of Judah and some of the kings of Israel and never mentions anything like that. So there's God measuring something, and he never even mentions its achievements or successes. Can you see how God thinks in a totally different way? So what, therefore, does he measure for each of these men? He measures their faithfulness. He's absolutely focused in on this question of faithfulness. That's what he judges them on, whether they were faithful. We see it in the life of Jehoshaphat, as he does well. God praises him, but he never mentions his abilities or achievements at all. We don't even know anything about whether Jehoshaphat was past his O-levels or anything. Nothing at all. What happened to unemployment or nothing. But we know that he didn't serve or worship the Baals, that he sought for God, that he walked in the commandments, that his heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord, and also he made it a priority to send out his best people to teach God's word. Those are the things that God tells us about Jehoshaphat. Pretty much nothing else about what he did. Then we get King Amaziah of Judah. He began well and showed some faithfulness, but his problem was that he wasn't sufficiently wholehearted in his faithfulness. He had limits to it. He put limits on what he would do. And it says, he did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart. Now you see, do you want it said to you at the judgment seat that you did well, did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart? Wouldn't you spend the rest of the millennium just remembering those words, yet not with a whole heart, and be really sad about it? Because there are going to be many people, I believe, very firmly at the judgment seat who are going to be both shocked and disappointed and really quite devastated with the things that Jesus says to them. Because he's going to be very frank, and he's going to raise with us his assessment of what we've done. And I don't want him to say to me that you weren't really wholehearted though, were you? Can you imagine it? So the three things that caused Amaziah to go astray in the end, because he began well, and this is a common theme which we'll return to, beginning well and going wrong. This is Amaziah. Number one, he did not fully trust in God to help him, so he formed an alliance with the idolatrous northern kingdom. God didn't want him to. Number two, he had a military victory, but he seized the other side's false gods and idols and took them back to Jerusalem and ended up getting into idolatry because he took their idols. And three, his heart became proud and overconfident. And that's what God says about Amaziah. Now, would you want that said about you? Now, this is a man who, on the face of it, does well because he has military victories. He must have been doing well because his heart became proud and overconfident. Well, how do you get to have a proud and overconfident heart other than by doing well? So you'd imagine, wouldn't you, that if you're doing well, you must be good. That's not the way God sees it. You can be doing well and having victories, but you're not pleasing to him because you're not faithful in the way that you're relating to him. And also, if you don't keep up your faithfulness, you might start with faithfulness and give up on it. King Uzziah of Judah, he likewise began well and ended badly. And the same problems: pride, overconfidence, and presumption. We're told how King Uzziah began his reign. It says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He feared God. He sought the Lord. Well, that's a good beginning. But why not carry on? Why stop? If that's what you started as, why stop doing that? But he didn't. He changed. He became proud. He became haughty. He became presumptuous. And it's a common feature of people who do well that they do become proud and haughty. It's a very common feature. And we need to guard against it. It's very, very important not to become proud of your achievements or your current successes or your past successes. But another point to make is this, that God doesn't praise any of these men for their abilities. Now, why doesn't he? Once you begin to think about it, it's completely obvious why he doesn't, because all their abilities came from him. So if God was to praise you for your abilities, it would be completely pointless. It would be like him coming to the judgment seat, praising you for being tall, praising you for having blue eyes, praising you for having brown eyes, praising you for having nice blonde hair, praising you for whatever. All those things are what he gave you. They're of no interest to him. He's not bothered about those. So the things that bother us, he's not bothered about. So if Mozart was to go to the judgment seat, which I suspect he won't, I hope he will, but I doubt it. But if Mozart was to be saved, I don't think God will praise him for his composing. Now, why would not Mozart be praised for his composing? Because it was all done for him. He just used to arrive in his head. So into his head would come complete works of music. He'd just be hearing it. And all he ever did was write it down. So what would Mozart then, if he was a believer, what might he be praised for? If he was to get a badge or a crown or a prize, it would read, awarded prize by Jesus for diligence in writing down music. That's what he would get a prize for. Now, none of us would think that would be Mozart's prize, but I think that would be the prize he would get. A diligent writer down of things that you heard. But so far as God is concerned, Mozart didn't compose anything. The Holy Spirit gave all of that to Mozart, and he just wrote it down. And once you begin to think in these terms, you see the whole thing of judgment quite differently. It's not about ability or success, because your success, it might be about success, provided your success comes from faithfulness and diligence. But if your success comes from being brilliant or from being very, very physically talented or being a brilliant footballer or something, you could be the best footballer in the world, and God wouldn't even mention it at the judgment seat. He would consider it irrelevant. And he would talk about other things, like whether you were a generous passer of the ball, or whether you worked hard in midfield when your side was losing. And he'd be saying, well, hang on a minute, I'm Pele, or why are you talking about this? And he'd say, well, never mind that. I'm talking about your character and the way you played. I'm not bothered whether you scored or it was me that I scored those goals, not you. I gave you that talent. Do you see? And we need to start to think in terms of faithfulness, not talent. Because talent you won't be praised for. You won't be awarded or any prizes for it, because he gave it all to you. It'd be like Jesus awarding the prize to himself, wouldn't it? For giving you talent. Why would he do that? So, one feature that emerges from this sorry list of kings and how they started well and ended badly, is that the harder tests come as you get older and more successful, in inverted commas. You have to put successful in inverted commas, because it's not necessarily successful when you're being successful. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's actually quite deceptive. But the harder lessons come later on. And one of the hardest tests, I've found this too, is the temptation to become self-satisfied and rest on your laurels, to become proud and complacent. And we're told of in 2 Chronicles about Uzziah, but when he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. So he became strong, which in part, he became strong because he was faithful. But you see the tragedy of that. God rewards you for your faithfulness, and then you respond wrongly to the reward. And then cause the reward to become the basis for your unfaithfulness and the loss of the accolade that he would have given you. So when we do well in life, we need to be very careful, because we could be doing well in some field, whether it's business or academic life or the church, or be a great preacher or be a great anything. That is a test. And it's one of the hardest tests, is the test of success. And not many people can pass the test of success. Quite a lot of people can pass the test of failure and disaster and hardship. I mean, it's hard, but people can understand that as a test. But not many people realize that success is a test. Doing well is a test. Having affluence is a test. Having power is a test. That's a big test. I started off having no power. I was just knee-high to a grasshopper in the police force. I was lower than a litter bin in terms of what I had no power over anything. So I started off right at the bottom, and that was difficult in its own way. But the harder tests come when you're in charge of lots of people. It's how do you use power but don't abuse it? How do you have power over people but don't enjoy it? You're not there to enjoy having power over people. You're not there to enjoy having control over people's lives or influence over their outcomes of their careers. God gives you that authority, but he's testing you to see how you'll handle it. And it's a harder test. I would say that's a harder test than being at the bottom and having difficult inspectors. If I had to choose which is the hardest, that's probably the easier one. Being in charge is the harder test, because more is asked of you, more is expected of you. And it doesn't look like a test either. It's disguised as not a test. You can more easily recognize difficulty as a test, but how many people are wise enough to see success, affluence, victory as tests? They don't look like tests, but they are. So Ahaz was bad all along. He was bad from start to finish. But again with Ahaz, no mention of gross domestic product or balance of payments or anything like that. All he's judged on, he didn't do what was right in God's eyes. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, that's the northern kingdom. He made molten images of the Baals, and he even burned his own sons as human sacrifices. But there's no mention of his successes or achievements, or lack thereof. So it's not like God is saying, and he messed up the balance of payments, inflation got out of control, unemployment was high. No mention. They might have been doing quite well, for all we know. The point is, God wasn't interested in any of that. He was interested in his faithfulness. Same with Hezekiah. He did well. But for the things he was praised for were not the ordinary things we'd expect, like restoring the economy or building up the military. He was praised for leading the people into greater faithfulness towards God. That's what God talks about with Hezekiah. What a contrast with our own political leaders or even church leaders. Now, you might think, yes, but you're talking about political leaders now. Not much can be expected of them. But in the church, every church leader has as his focus the development of the character of himself and his people, and godliness and faithfulness and so on. No, they don't. So many church leaders don't have that as their objective at all. They have other objectives: looking good, being big, wanting to get big, wanting to be well known, wanting to be famous, etc. And that's frequently the case. But it's not just church leaders, it's all sorts of people. All of us have those temptations to want to seem good, to look good, to appear successful, to have the trappings of success. And we're not setting faithfulness as our objective. forgetting that that's principally going to be the thing God will test. So this series of kings that we see tested here, you're meant to look at this and realize that you're going to be measured and tested in a very similar way at the judgment seat. And you might say, well, I can't be judged on that basis. I've never been a king. Whether you're a king is neither here nor there. You'll be judged on your faithfulness as a bus conductor, or as a composer, or as a chartered accountant. It doesn't matter whether you're a king or not. It just happens that these fellas were kings. Being a king is neither here nor there. You're being faithful is the issue. So Josiah, this is one of my heroes. More wholehearted than any of his predecessors, even the good ones. And this is the verdict on Josiah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in the ways of David his father. And he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. So you know where it went a bit wrong with Uzziah? Where it was good and then, ended on a minor note. But here, the second part of the exam, he does well. And he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. So he started well and continued well. When you want Jesus to say that to you. So, and this is the ultimate accolade that was said of him. It said, before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, and with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Now that's Jesus, like Torval and Dean, where you get the 10 coming up like this. That's Jesus putting up a 10, isn't it, for Josiah. That is about as good as it gets by way of commendation. Everything was faithful about him, and he didn't change. That's the key. So, how do we get to be like Josiah and some of these others who did well, and avoid being like some of the ones who went wrong? Because it's not easy to be faithful, especially over a long period of time. So if you're facing a sudden sharp shock, sometimes it can be easier to handle a sudden sharp shock than 90 years of steady faithfulness. I've raised it to 90, by the way. I was told off for saying 70 before. I've upped it to 90. So that's a harder test, to keep going and not getting proud. So long-suffering, but just continuous diligence, being faithful year after year after year after year after year after year, decade after decade, not getting proud, rising up, allowing God, because inevitably, if you're faithful, you will be raised up. But there comes the danger. If you're faithful and are raised up, then you'll get proud, unless you choose not to be proud. There comes the test, the second part of the test. Did you begin well? Did you end well? And that ending well is a hard one. And none of us should be assuming that we're all doing well. We should be asking whether we're doing well. Because you'll notice in the 7 letters in Revelation, you get the impression with all those letters that everything Jesus says to them comes as a bit of a surprise. It wasn't what they were expecting. It's all a bit the opposite of what they might have been thinking. So the ones who were thinking they were doing badly were doing well, and the ones thinking they were doing well were doing badly. Now, if that's the case for the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Asia, what are we doing thinking that it's obvious that we're doing well, if that's what we're thinking? So, at any rate, one way of staying faithful is for the judgment seat of Christ to become a vivid reality to you. What time are we finishing, by the way, Chris? What time? 25. Sorry? 25. Well, that's the time for recording. After that, question and answer. Okay, yeah. That's good. So, if the judgment seat becomes a reality to you and vivid, and you think about it regularly, that alone will make a huge impact. Remembering that you've got to face that one day. What does it say here in Romans? Every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God. So each of us shall give account of himself to God. Now that you can't look on that. See, that first bit sounds good, But this latter bit in verse 12 doesn't sound so good. Each one of us shall give an account of himself. Well, the question is, how do you view that? Do you view that with total confidence? Or do you view it with a sense of alarm? I view it with alarm. And this is like telling me that there's an A-level exam coming up. But how do you view that? Do you think, oh, no worries? Or do you think, well, dear me, an A-level exam? The one who thinks, oh, no worries, how well do you think he's going to do in comparison to the lad that says, oh dear, an A-level, I better get ready, I better get thinking about that now? It's the one who thinks that's going to do well, not the one who says it's no worries. And we need to be taking that attitude towards it and becoming more and more conscious of it and pondering on it. And also remembering what Jesus is going to be like when we meet him, because many of us think wrongly of what Jesus is going to be like and look like when we meet him. And we have a picture of him as being a sort of, as he was in his earthly ministry, looking like any ordinary man. There was nothing distinguishing about him that made him stand out in his appearance, particularly. That's not how he's going to be when we meet him, because he's going to be in his glorified condition. And you get the strong clue to this when you look at what Apostle John experienced, because he was Jesus' best friend. And when he saw Jesus in Revelation chapter 1, it says this: his head and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. It sounded like the Niagara Falls. And in his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth issued a sharp 2-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in full strength. And this is how John reacted. This is Jesus' best friend. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Now, it doesn't mean he fell at his feet in pleasure, admiration, and being delighted to see him. He fell at his feet in a mixture of astonishment, awe, reverence, and fear. He was afraid of Jesus. Now, if that's how John saw him, how ought we to see him? That is how he's going to be. And so that's why the judgment seat is going to be an awesome event. It's not going to be some kind of minor affair. It's going to be really, really an awesome event. That's why I want to minimize what I'm going to call section A of the judgment, what's wrong with me, and maximize what section B, what's right with me. And I want Jesus to say, well, I think we've pretty much dealt with that. You've raised these things with me on an ongoing basis. I think we've covered that. Let's move on to section B. That's what we want. And to have a person as Jesus really is, as he really is now, talking to you is going to be very, very awesome. And it will involve what we would rightly call fear and even terror. I think we're going to be astonished and afraid of him when we meet him. And so we need now, if we can realize that now, not just then, it will impact the way we live and behave now. Because nobody's going to get away with anything at the judgment seat. Nothing's going to be overlooked. Everything is being continuously assessed now. It says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, watching the evil and the good. So don't just think he's talking about the evil and the good. Proverbs 15:3. And Jesus knows all our real motives. There's no point trying to trick him. And there's no point tricking ourselves or telling ourselves we're doing well. Because he knows. He knows whether you're wholehearted or reluctant or whatever. So we need to become faithful in every conceivable way. Our word needs to be our bond. What we say needs to be held to. And I spent many years doing commercial litigation, representing one company against another. And always that arose because one company, one manager, one boss, one person wasn't keeping his word or was made some failure but was wanting to get away with it. So sometimes it would be they'd break promises. Other times it would be that they'd fail but try to get away with it, trying to dodge liability for it. And they were, in many ways, unfaithful men. If they weren't unfaithful, I wouldn't have had a job to do. They were unfaithful. And so in business today, so few people can be trusted, really trusted, that you can't operate really on the basis of just word. a handshake and word, like you could 100 years ago, apparently. Men could be trusted. They'd say they'd do a thing, they would do it. No, they didn't bother writing a contract. You just knew that if Mr. Cadbury said he'd do a thing, then he would do a thing. You didn't have to get him to write it down for you and agree with you in advance what the damages would be if he breaks his promise. Imagine saying that to George Cadbury. Now, what, Mr. Cadbury, can we deal with in advance the question of anticipatory damages in case you welch on the deal? Do you see? You wouldn't need to say it to him, but you do now. That's written into contracts. What will happen if? So we need to be faithful in all relationships, everything. Look at Samuel. Samuel was a judge over Israel, and he was able at the end of his career to stand up and challenge everybody. He challenged the whole nation to name even a single occasion when he'd ever acted unfaithfully. Now, could you do that? Could you stand up in front of the people in your town or church and say, please name an occasion when I have ever been unfaithful or done anything unrighteous or unfaithful? Would you like to try it in the next service? If you stood up and said that, what would people say? Maybe they'd be polite, I don't know. But let it be so from today, because we could set that as our objective from today onwards. We'll do nothing unfaithful, no letting down of people by unfaithfulness. I don't mean by mistakes or by blunders, but by unfaithfulness. Faithfulness to husband and wife. And there's so much divorce today. And frequently that arises, well, for all sorts of reasons, but one reason is adultery. But we need to fight that battle against adultery, not at the level of adultery, but right at the bottom level, not by even looking at anyone. And that's what Job did. He decided he wouldn't even gaze on anyone. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? He won't even look. So Job didn't need to deal with the battle against adultery because he wasn't even going anywhere near there. He was fighting the battle 100 yards earlier than that, at a much lower level. Faithfulness to our children. God will hold fathers in particular responsible for the spiritual condition of their children. And that's a solemn responsibility. And a lot of men delegate that to their wives, or if indeed they think about it at all. But I think God will hold fathers primarily responsible for that. Faithfulness to parents. I'd speak about this at some length in Book 1, about duties to our parents, but it's an issue that in this country is to some degree underestimated or even ignored. People are not thinking in terms of having a duty towards their parents in their old age especially, but we are, and God regards us as accountable for that. I once had a chap come to see me when I was still in practice, and his parents had been missionaries, and he said they were elderly, and he wanted me to give them free advice and free help because we were a law firm, and we spoke of me being a Christian in the firm. And he came to say if I would ask if I would give him free help. But it never occurred to him that he could pay for the help that they would get. He wanted me to donate to his parents so that he wouldn't have to do anything for them. And the thing was, he never even, that thought never even formed in his head. Oh, how about me paying a law firm to help my parents? He thought the help that he would give to his parents was to get someone else to support them. Do you see what I mean? I mean, maybe he had nothing. He didn't say that. But he never raised that. I don't think it ever occurred to him. So, faithfulness to friends. So, we need to avoid gossip. We need to control our tongue. If we're told a secret, then don't tell anybody. Build a reputation for being able to be trusted with confidential information. And we need to be the kind of person who tells the truth and gives honest advice. And so many people are two-faced, and they will speak well to your face and badly behind your back. But a Christian needs to be someone who tells the truth to people's faces and then defends them behind their back. Now that's quite a strange creature. We hardly know such a person that is forthright and honest to your face, but defends you when you're not there behind your back. That's what a Christian should be. Faithfulness to our employer. I've noticed, because I've had so much involvement in employment law, how remarkable it is how many employees resent, despise, or even hate their employer. It's astonishing. I find it amazing. And maybe it's a British thing, I don't know, but it's certainly the case. But it's so common, even amongst believers, even amongst Christians, to speak disparagingly of their boss or employer or business they work for. But that's not faithful. We should be utterly loyal to the business that we're working for. Paul speaks in Titus. He says, urge bondslaves to be subject to their own masters in everything, to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, but showing all good faith, so that they will adorn the doctrine of God our Saviour in every respect. So Paul was writing about how we go to work, what we do at work. He's very concerned about it. And also, slaves, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters, with fear and trembling. It says, in singleness of heart, as to Christ, not in the way of eye service, or men as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, as to the Lord and not to men. So all work is really being done for God. And that's really who you're working for. And so when you go to work each day as a whatever it is, that is who you're working for. And we need to resolve to become the most faithful member of staff in our workplace. That is entirely within your grasp to achieve that, because it's a race in which nobody else is competing. You're the only one in the race because nobody else sees that as an objective. If you say to yourself, I want to be the most faithful employee in this business, you will be the most faithful. So, also, the duty to be faithful to an employer is not conditional upon him also being faithful to you. It's nice if he is, but whether he is or not is not actually relevant. You're to be faithful no matter what other people do. Indeed, the more faithful you can be to people who mistreat you, the more you're passing God's test. That's the very thing. If every boss was marvellous and wonderful and was like, I don't know, John Walton or something, if everyone worked for Mr. Walton, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But not everyone's like that. And if you can work for a rude, ignorant, selfish boss, or with rude, ignorant, selfish colleagues and supervisors and so on, and yet remain sweet and not be resentful and not be bitter and not be nasty, not join in, be faithful, work hard. They're all pulling sickies, but you're not. You might be the only one to turn up on the night after the Christmas do. You're the only one that turns up to work the next morning. They've all got flu, and except you. And that's a great honour, isn't it, to be the only man without flu the day after the work's due. These are the things that God notices. And I believe that at the judgment seat, Jesus will be raising things like that. He'll say, do you remember the night of the work's due back in the year such and such? And the day after, when you were the only one that showed up to work? You'll say, no, remind me, when was it? What are you talking about? And he'll say, oh, it made a big impression on me. Do you see? And you didn't even think it was a test. But he remembered it. All sorts of things like that will surprise us. The things we didn't even know that he was even thinking about, never mind remembering. So we be submissive to those people. That doesn't mean we can't question bosses or even confront them, but we're not to do it discourteously, improperly, dishonestly, or disloyally. If we want to speak about a boss, go to the boss, if that can be done. But not behind backs, not criticizing behind backs and mocking and so on. Because Jesus hears all that. And he's not pleased by it. Let me move on. Faithfulness to customers, clients, and patients. This is a big one. Again, this is something you're spending 8 hours a day doing, probably, or you used to be. And we need to do our best standard of work at all times, regardless of whether the customer is watching or will ever find out. And also regardless of whether he's a rich or poor customer, a powerful or weak one. It doesn't matter whether he's a managing director or a dinner lady, and we're repairing the car for them, that we need to do our best work, even though they don't know whether we did good work. That dinner lady might never know whether you did a faithful job on the car service. They'll never know. Maybe no one will ever know, but Jesus finds time to monitor the servicing of cars. This is the point. The things he takes an interest in and remembers. and you're on your own. Nobody's there. But the point is that those people who pay for you to work for them are contractually entitled to your best service. You're under a duty to give them service at the best level that you know how to. If you're an employer, turning it round. A manager has many duties, many responsibilities. Wages need to be paid on time. Some managers, some bosses and proprietors don't pay wages on time. They hold wages back to help cash flow and things like this. When I first started out in business, there were times when we couldn't pay ourselves, but we could pay the staff. But we had to pay the staff and not pay ourselves. And now someone might say, well, you're a mug then for doing that. No, that's what God wanted. He even says here in James, he says, look, the wages you failed to pay, the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. So Jesus is a kind of shop steward. He's listening. He's listening to what the laborers in the field are saying. He's interested not only in watching cars being serviced, but also people in fields not getting their wages on time. He's interested in that. But also, this is one of the duties of a boss that I've found to be almost invariably not done. And that is standing up to bullies and tyrants in the workplace. You might think that's an obscure point to raise. I don't think it is. Workplaces that I've ever been in or worked over or been supervised over have been infested with nasty, vicious, tyrannical little monsters. And they don't look like monsters. They look like little secretaries, or they look like they don't look vicious, but they're as vicious as you could ever meet when you really get to know what they're like. And the duty of a boss is to stand up to them. But most bosses don't want to do it because it's emotionally draining, it takes a lot of time, it takes courage, it's costly, it's exhausting, it takes hours of work to deal with bullies because you have to confront them, meet them, interview them, all the rest of it. And you think, well, I'm a busy manager, I'm doing all this. This person here has been bullying this secretary. Here I am, I've got better things to do. But God is saying, no, I put you in charge of this workplace. This secretary is in distress. I want you to look after them. And the point is, most managers won't do that because they can't be bothered, but also because they don't have the courage. It actually takes quite a lot of courage as a boss to face people down and confront them, because the people who do this, once you actually confront them, the masks come off and you see them with their proper teeth, and they're quite vicious. But I've had to do it time after time after time, facing them down. And partly God did it because he wanted me to have plenty of material for book 6 about handling the wicked. I'm seriously, literally serious. He sent them my way. He wanted me to have one like this and one like that, like a complete box of Thorntons. You've got every kind of vicious, wicked person you could imagine. They all had to come to work for me so there could be chapters in my book. And God wanted me to deal with them one after another after another. And but most bosses don't do that, and I think they'll be held accountable for it. Also faithful to remember and repay those who've helped us. Remember the story in the life of Joseph about the cupbearer and the baker. Joseph helped them both, and the one who survived, the cupbearer, promptly forgot him. So he was massively helped by Joseph, and then he totally forgot him. Now, how many people have helped us and then we forget them? We need to be faithful in thanking and repaying and rewarding and returning the favor to those who've been faithful and helpful to us. We also need to be faithful to our enemies in a certain way. That means knowing how to handle them, but not becoming like them. And so a Christian, in a certain way, is to treat his enemies better than most people treat their friends. You're to be faithful to them, honest with them, straight with them, one-faced with them, not two-faced, and yet at the same time to oppose them to the degree that they need opposing. Because you can defend yourself and you can tackle them and remove them, but you mustn't become like them. And so a Christian is meant to be as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove. But what you'll frequently find is they become as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a serpent, or they become as wise as a dove and innocent as a dove. It doesn't work that way. We've got to deal with enemies in the right way, with shrewdness and discernment, and yet not being like them. Shrewd in the way we handle the wicked, but not like them. Innocent in our own way. Genuine, sincere, faithful, honest. Not stooping to their level, not fighting fire with fire, but removing them without dropping to their standard. And that's easier said than done, I can assure you of that. I've had to remove a lot of them. And it was always difficult. And you have to, there you are in a position where years ago you were at the bottom, now you're at the top, and you're removing people. But how do you remove a wicked person without in some way enjoying it, or taking some kind of pleasure out of it, or without being unfair to them? You think, well, how do you handle it with proper, not just proper procedure, but proper integrity in the way you handle the whole thing? It's difficult to do, I can tell you that. Another thing, faithfulness. Faithfulness with money. We need to rid ourselves of the love of money. And we mustn't imagine that the love of money only affects rich people. In my personal experience, for what it's worth, poorer people can love money just as much as rich people can love money. In many ways more than. We need to rid ourselves of selfish ambition, because that's one of the ways in which we lose our faithfulness. Godly ambition is fine. We can always aim to do our best and to rise to the highest level that we can reach to, but not at the price of sacrificing faithfulness. Never at that price. And we can never do wrong in order to protect our career or protect our position or protect our promotion. There are no sort of, you can't just adopt an unlimited approach whereby you just do everything you want to do to protect yourself. Sometimes you can't protect yourself. You have to accept the consequences of being faithful, which may be negative. We need to rid ourselves of the desire to be highly approved of or highly esteemed. That's a very difficult one, because there's a deep craving in most people to be approved of. But you'll never be able to be faithful if you want to be approved of, because the world's values are so different. It's impossible to please the world and God. You can't do it. And therefore, you have to just say, I'm not going to try to do it. I'm going to please God, and if that happens to please the odd person along the way, that's nice, that's a bonus, but it's not my objective. We can't manipulate people. How many people do this? It's astonishing. Where instead of being direct and straightforward, people use manipulation. They try to maneuver, bouncing the red off that other red and onto this red in order to get what they want. Well, you just have to walk up to that red ball and say, I'm just talking to this red ball in this way, direct, not bounce back, trying to get what you want by using people, tricking people, pretending things to people. The polite word for it is manipulation and control, but the blunter word is witchcraft, because that's what witchcraft really is in its proper meaning. It's the use of soulish power to manipulate others, to get them to do what you want. And we can't do that. We have to be honest enough to say to people what we really mean, as courteously as we can. But if saying to people what we really mean causes them to disapprove of us or not to do what we want, then so be it. We can't trick people pretending that it's diplomacy or courtesy when actually it's manipulation. We must say what we really mean to people without being rude, but being honest. I'm going to skip over some pieces here. Courage. This is another interesting thing. I think one of the principal causes of lack of faithfulness is lack of courage. People say that, people often excuse themselves in this because they say, oh, that's genetic. That's the way I am. I'm genetically not born courageous. But I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that the quality of courage is anything to do with genetics. Because you can have people who, for example, aren't afraid of heights, but that's nothing to do with courage. Courage is not about not being afraid of heights. Courage is about being afraid of heights, but being willing to go high up if that's what God wants you to do. So if you're not afraid of heights, that doesn't make you courageous. It just happens to be that you're not afraid of heights. Do you see what I mean? It's nothing to do with courage. So what is courage then? Courage is only experienced by people who are afraid. You can't be courageous unless you're afraid. If you're not afraid, then you're just not, that means you just happen not to be afraid of heights or whatever. But in any case, the kind of courage God asks us principally to show doesn't normally have to do with heights or spiders or things like that. The kind of courage that God wants us to show is moral courage. It's being willing to receive unpopularity, criticism, ridicule, mockery, etc., etc. That has nothing to do with genetics. It's whether you're willing to do that. And I've often said to people, and this is a rule I try to live by, that I will never make a decision based on fear. So whenever something has to be decided, I have decided that I will not be influenced by fear. So if, for example, shall I do this or shall I do that? If I do this, that appeals to me because I'm not afraid of doing this. If I do this, I'm afraid of doing this. Well, I've decided that I will not allow that to be on the agenda. So the only question is, what does God want me to do? This or this? Is this right or is this right? How about this I'm afraid of? Yeah, but that's not a relevant consideration and I will not be influenced by it. And you'd be surprised how often that comes up. And the demons will try to guide you through fear. But if you say, I will not be influenced by it, well then you're rendering them largely redundant. One of their principal methods is sort of closed down. And basically we are as courageous as we choose to be. So God never commands you to be tall or clever or handsome, but he does command us to be courageous. Well, that proves it's not genetic. Because if you can find a place where God commands you to be tall or commands you to have nice blue eyes, well then you'd have a point. But he never does. He always commands you to do things that are within your choice, a matter of the will. It's nothing to do with not being afraid. It's to do with going ahead despite being afraid. This is the point which I think so many of us miss. And I've heard people talk, well, I can't do that because I'm afraid. No. Being afraid is the qualifying condition that enables you now to be tested. If you weren't afraid, there would be no test. Do you see? If the test was, will you cross the road or will you, I don't know, watch an episode of Postman Pat? Well, where would be the test in that? If you're not afraid, how can that be a test? It's got to be something that you don't want to do. What you fear doing, and then you do it anyway. So a coward is someone who feels exactly the same fear, or even less fear, but he's decided he's not going to do it. He's not going to face up to it. In fact, he faces less fear, because his fear is totally academic and theoretical, because he knows he's not going to do it anyway. But the brave person, his fear is real, because he knows he's not got the chance or the option to run away. But if you know you can run away, well, what's the problem? What is there to be afraid of anyway? So I find another helpful thing is to work out the worst case scenario and then accept it. So he's facing a situation, and what could happen now? This and this and this, and then that, and then they could do this to me, I suppose, and then they could do this. Right, oh, well, that's the worst case. I accept it. I accept the worst case, and I'm going to go ahead anyway. And then what I try and do is better that. I try and work out something better than that. But if you accept the worst case at the beginning, you remove all the fear from then on, because now it's all about improvement. It's all about bettering that worst case scenario. But if you're saying, I'm not sure whether I'll see how things go, and I'll keep making mind up from time to time whether I'm going to carry on. If you do that, you'll never carry on, because all the demons have got to do is bring you a little bit more pressure and you'll stop. But if you say, I don't care what you do to me, I'm just going to carry on, you actually remove all of that scope that they have for intimidating you. Because they think, what's the point of intimidating you? You're going to carry on anyway. And you make it's rather unfair to the poor things, but you're really making life unpleasant for them, because they don't know what to do next. What are we going to do with you? Because you've decided you're going to do it anyway. All we know how to do is try and make you afraid, and that's not going to influence you. So what are we going to do? And then I've got more detail here about all these kings that started well and did badly in the end. All the good stuff. Here's another one. Being faithful after you lose your mentor's influence. This is an important one. There's a lot of people in the Bible who started faithful when they had a mentor, but they lose their mentor and they don't realize that's a test. And this happened to a person called Joash, King Joash. And for many years he was righteous while Jehoiada was alive. But then Jehoiada died, and Joash had to carry on without him as his advisor. When that happened, he went astray. He went wrong. Now, Jehoiada's son, Zechariah, came along and tried to advise him to stop it. But he had Zechariah killed because he was affronted that this man came along to criticize him. So after Jehoiada had died, he went his own way and became his own man and went wrong. But he didn't realize that that was a test. So the death of Jehoiada was a test. And he was meant to recognize that as a test. What should he have done? He should have thought, oh dear, I've had Jehoiada for all these decades. He's kept me on the straight and narrow. What am I going to do now without Jehoiada? And if he'd thought that, he'd said, well, what shall I do? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to immerse myself in the Bible more so I can gain guidance for myself. And I'm going to seek another Jehoiada, someone who'll help me. But he didn't do either of those things. He went on by himself and failed the test. What was the test? Can you carry on after your mentor is gone? Do you see? And I think we should aim to get more radical, not less radical, as we get older. Because being balanced is good, but being moderate is not good. And so moderation has nothing to do with balance. Balance is what God wants us to be. But he doesn't want moderate people, he wants radical people. And why should someone in their 30s or 50s or 70s be less radical than someone in their teens or 20s? You should get more radical with each decade because you're nearer to the judgment, for one thing. And also you've got more understanding. So the more understanding you have, the more you need to understand the need for radicalness and to be less satisfied with what we're doing. So let me finish with this. This is a quote by D.L. Moody. And he put it this way. He said, the world has yet to see what God can do with and for and through and in and by a man who is fully and wholly consecrated to him. I will do my utmost to be that man. And that's true. There has never been a person who's been all those things. But D.L. Moody got pretty close to it. And so by setting that as his target, he didn't achieve it. No one ever does. But he wanted to get as close to it as he could. And so should we. Take note of that. Aim to do the very, very best that you could ever be in terms of faithfulness, not influencing the gross domestic product, not getting inflation down, unless, of course, that is your job, but being faithful. And have God say to you, well done, good and faithful servant, at the judgment. So there we are. Have I got within was I within? Good. All right, well, thank you very much. So is that, what do we do now? Is that finished? Yep. If anybody wants to raise a question, I mean, I've kept you going to the end. I've tried your patience. If anyone has a question, they're welcome to ask it.